Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and this bag that you see out here, it's a fabric grow bag, but it's not growing any plants. It's being used for housing worms. So I don't call it a grow bag, I call it a worm bag. And in the past it had always been referred to as the outdoor worm bag, but now it's kind of referred to as previously the outdoor worm bag because it was outdoors up until 74 days ago, but there was some cold weather anticipated, and I really wanted to let these worms remain active and keep them warm. So I brought them inside down here to my wormery, and they've been down here ever since. The overall age of the bin is 342 days old. That's only, whew, man, we're pretty close. 3 weeks and a couple days away from being a year old. And over the course of its lifespan, it's been fed 26 times. And feeding number 27, you might have already caught a peek of it down here. It's a portion of coffee, a day's worth of coffee, as well as some peels off of some carrots, some regular orange carrots, as well as some of those white carrots, parsnips I think they're called. So this bin is really getting there as far as being mature. In fact, we've thought about maybe getting this thing geared up for harvest one of these days soon. But I was reviewing the video from the last check-in, which was 10 days ago, and the last check-in included its last feeding. And it did seem to me like there was still a pretty good substantial amount of bedding in here that the worms can still be working on. So it seemed to me like if we find a pretty good abundance of lingering bedding in here today, we might keep going for another feeding or two. And I guess originally I had thought about trying to avoid the whole idea of going more than a year or exceeding a year in age on this system, but there's no problem if we do that. I always put these little thoughts into my mind like, oh my goodness, we can't let that happen. We must avoid this or that from happening. So it's certainly not a problem if we exceed a year in age. So you can see all kinds of worms hanging out here on the surface. And right off the bat, I noticed another little creature hanging out here, which is not a worm. I think that's just a millipede. It's interesting how they kind of curl up. Sometimes when you find these millipedes and they're very, very young still and they curl up like that, they look almost like they're snails or something. So the material out here on the surface is so nice. It's so cool ever since we put that plastic that we just removed across the top here. It's been keeping the entire top surface nice and damp all the way out to the edges, and to me that just seems like it gives the entire system a good fair chance at being worked on, because anytime material in your bin starts to get dry, the worms are simply going to avoid that, and they're going to look for more hospitable, more damp and cozy material to hang out in. And there was one thing that I had kind of kicked around last time, which was the idea of maybe trying to do a more concerted effort on collecting up all the loose fragments of bedding type materials still lingering within this material. So I thought we would kind of do that, since we usually go around the bin anyway and inspect how things look. We might as well collect up all those things that look like they're just either leftover food bits, like this is the shell of an avocado. Something like that is generally going to take quite some time. And if it's all the way out there against the edge of the bag, the wall of the bag, I mean the bag is actually two bags, and in between the two layers of bag there's sheets of plastic, but in places I know I must have probably missed the plastic liner in between the two bags. So I think in certain places it does tend to ventilate a little bit. And it's in those places it seems like the moisture of the material tends to wick out through the walls of the bag and gets lost to evaporation. So, I don't know, have we made it all the way around yet? I don't remember. I think I started out kind of opposite of me, reaching across. So I think we've made it pretty much all the way around. I think when the time comes to try to migrate the worms out of their castings, I'm probably going to do so in a different container. I was really tempted to even get that started today, but I sort of talked myself out of it. I figured, let's let this system keep going. Let's not feel like we're in some way, dictated by the calendar or by how many days have elapsed for the system being in service. Figured let's just keep going with it, maybe for another feeding or two. I guess the main reason being that there's so much stuff that I can see lingering throughout this material. There have been times when the material has gotten a little bit drier and we've worked on rehydrating and protecting it from evaporation. So it's feeling pretty good now though, you know, because I guess that was the other thing. I felt like we were kind of teetering back and forth on too dry, or first I guess it was too wet when we first brought it in here. We allowed it to dry off, and then it kind of swung in the direction of possibly beginning to seem too dry, especially around the edges, and then we started using those protective measures to help the system keep its moisture. And it just felt like now that we've got sort of a pretty good balance of a system that seems to do a good job hanging on to its moisture, I figured let's keep going with it a little longer instead of finally getting to that point where things are more or less optimized from that point of view, and then just kind of calling it quits. I figured, well, let's let it go a little bit longer. So I'm going to grab something I can put this stuff into. This should fit. I got a little plastic container here. Just figured to get it out of the way so that when the time comes to reset the feeding area, this stuff will still be ready to go, but it won't be in our way, so that we can dig down into the middle now where we last fed and examine how the last feeding is coming along. I can't remember what it was that we fed last time. Perhaps pumpkin? I can't recall. If it was pumpkin, after 10 days, I would have to guess that we're probably going to see very little, if any, leftovers of it. So that's good enough. We don't have to be overly thorough here. We're just sort of having some fun. Perhaps if I see another large chunk of something here and there, I can keep picking it out, but it seems like I could do that all day. In fact, I was pretty tempted just to come over here with my screen and my little screening bucket system and just start doing handfuls of this stuff, especially when I grab a handful of stuff that seems to have a good amount of residual material in it. And then we would have, you know, an almost perfect separation of all the stuff that's small enough, fine enough to fall through the screen, the stuff that's almost finished castings, if not all finished castings, versus everything that gets caught in the screen, which would probably be a lot of leftover food bits, a lot of leftover bedding bits, and I figured, well, you know what? I think that might actually be the method that I follow when it comes time to transfer this material over into a plastic bus bin so that I can set up a horizontal migration. Because then I'll be, you know, needing to handle all the material in the system to get it moved out of here and over. And at that time, I guess we could just go handful by handful, scooping it into the screen, and then we'll be, you know, we'll have ourselves a nice large collection of stuff like this that we could use to set up a horizontal migration feeding zone. In fact, we could probably set the whole thing up with no additional materials. We could probably set up the entire horizontal feeding zone with stuff that we just collect out of this system, because there is quite a bit of it all over the place. Now, I would imagine if we ran all this stuff through the screen, we would have ourselves a fairly substantial collection of material that could be used to build up a horizontal migration feeding zone. I mean, some people might be just thinking, hey, you used to forage a lot, why not do foraging? And I guess that would be another option, you know, possibly just coming in here once in a while to make sure moisture levels are still adequate and not come in to give them any food, just to make sure everything's okay, make sure everything's hydrated thoroughly, and then gradually give the worms an opportunity to break down a lot of this lingering stuff, you know, rather than coming in here with fresh foods for them all the time. Let them, you know, turn their focus onto what's still left in here, you know. Instead of getting fresh foods to nibble on, they'd be able to really break down all the residual bits of bedding and food that still remains in here. So we've just kind of excavated the entire feeding area. I figured I would just kind of create a nice big pit for us to put today's feeding into. And perhaps this way too we can pick through all the stuff that we just excavated and collect up all the leftovers. So I see chunks of leftover corn cob. I see a lot more of this crabgrass. Although I must admit, I don't see quite as much as I thought I would. I thought there'd be a whole lot more of it. It seems like a large portion of what came out in my hands when I grabbed in here and excavated was mainly castings and a whole bunch of worms. But it does seem like there is a lot of nice castings in here. And these are, you know, you could see there's a pretty good sized population in here. These little guys would do a good job if they were cut loose on a nice new environment. So it does seem like a shame to have them cruising around in a whole bunch of more or less finished castings and possibly get them working on a nice fresh batch somewhere at some point soon. And then we can give this bag, you know, a little break before we reset it, but it probably will be time soon to get this thing reset and get it going again as worm bag version 5.0. Those version numbers that I use are really just sort of designations of how many years I've been doing the outdoor worm system. So, alright, enough of this picking through. I think we've collected up a pretty good assortment of stuff, and I guess what we could do is use that stuff to reset the feeding zone right down in the middle again, like we always do. So I don't know, I just saw another piece of asparagus there. I saw a couple more possible handfuls of stuff I could pick out of here. But it's almost like a piece of artwork, you know? I mean, like a painting, right? If a painter wanted to, the painter could always grab their paintbrush and add one more stroke. So it's really got to come to a point where you've got to sort of call it quits, and even though you could keep going easily, you have to make the conscious decision to stop. So let's do that now. Let's stop. And then we could get this stuff right back down into the middle. I don't know, if we keep doing it this way, we can probably 2 or 3 times like this, we would eventually have everything centralized in the middle neatly. And we would gradually pick most of the debris and leftover stuff out of the castings in general. Oh, what do we have here? Is this thing activating? So this system used to live outside, and that means black soldier flies could have moved in here. And this is the larva of a black soldier fly. And it looks to me like it's alive. But I thought, you know, I didn't think there were any of them in here. Anytime I do find one of these, I just take it outside. I bring it out to my outdoor compost barrel. And if the little guy wants to at some point transform into a fly there, that's okay. But I really don't want to have flying insects down here in my wormery in my basement. The little guy would be lonely anyway, you know. Once those little guys pupate into a flying insect, their only job is to find a mate, and then within a very short period of time after mating and laying eggs, their life ends. So it'd be kind of a shame to have that little guy go through all that trouble of, you know, developing into a fly only to be down here in my basement without any other black soldier flies around to potentially hook up with. So being outside is the better place for a black soldier fly, that's for sure. Alright, very nice. I don't know why I just can't seem to resist going and going with this thing. So let's drop in this nice collection of bedding materials onto which today's feeding can go. Yeah, that's really nice. That's pretty cool. I think the worms are going to appreciate that. Let's bring in the food, which it's more or less frozen. It's been out of the freezer now for probably over an hour now, but it's such a big lump of stuff that it's probably had very little chance to thaw out. So besides the carrots, the white and orange carrots in here, there's also some couple grapes, a couple little bonus snacks in here, a couple grapes that just didn't look quite right. So I had them at the bottom of the bag, and a little extra sweetness in addition to the veggies. And you gotta admit, that's a nice, generous feeding we're giving these guys now. And on top of all that vegetable matter, we could drop in all this delicious coffee. And like I do oftentimes nowadays, I really do like to combine the coffee with something else, anything really, it doesn't matter what, but I just don't like the idea of having a big pile of coffee in there. It just seems like it's not going to make a whole lot of progress if it just sits there alone, but when it seems, or at least when I mix it with other stuff, it seems like it gets worked on quite nicely. So the really nice white, bright colored powder I dropped in there, that was pulverized eggshell, which is the grit that I use when I feed my worm bins, and then this slightly more earthy color powder I'm dropping in now. This is my worm chow, just a variety of different pulverized things. And then I think when we mix all this stuff together, all these veggies, all those couple grapes, even some fruit matter in here, all this coffee, all this grit and worm chow, these worms are going to have a field day on this feeding area. You know what? This feeding zone indicator is what I would normally use a coffee filter for, to place it right out onto the top surface of my bin. But here I'm thinking, you know what? Why don't we use it as a way to keep all these beautiful castings we're going to backfill with from littering the feeding area, or vice versa for that matter. It'll kind of lock in the feeding area right below the coffee filter. And here too, see, big handfuls of leftover bedding type materials, more of this crabgrass, very slow going stuff. Oh, I feel bad now putting these little guys in here because all that stuff is frozen. So this way we can at least also, with that coffee filter there, protect any worms we're piling over the top here from getting exceedingly chilly by being placed on top of a bunch of frozen food. They'll probably appreciate having the opportunity to get away from that stuff if they don't like how cold it is. And then they can return to it once it has reached room temperature, and they can start nibbling on it. And I got a feeling a feeding like this is not going to last long. It's frozen, so by the time it thaws out, it's going to start turning to mush. And I'm sure soon after that, the worms are going to be able to start nibbling on it. All right. So no feeding zone indicator. We just use the coffee filter a little bit different than the way we usually do. Coffee filters usually rest right out here on the top surface of my bins to indicate where we last fed, but on this go around we sort of used it as a cap for the food and then backfilled afterwards. Little twist to my normal routine. Why not, right? I gotta tell you, this custom made edge to edge top covering plastic really seems to be doing an excellent job keeping the moisture down in this system. Hopefully that feeding we just gave them will also add a little bit of moisture. I'm sure not much, you know, carrots doesn't have a lot of moisture content, but perhaps by having been frozen and now the thawing process might allow it to kick off a little bit of moisture for the little guys. I'm sure they wouldn't mind that either. But in general, I would say that the material in here feels pretty good. A little bit of dry stuff we encountered around the very edges, but in general, the material in the system's in great shape. All right, everyone. I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.